Aaron David Miller, thanks for joining us. What should we make of Benjamin Netanyahu's renewed rejection of a two-state solution in the Middle East in his conversation with Joe Biden?
Tip O'Neill, longstanding member of the House, once observed that all politics is local. And the reality is, for Mr. Netanyahu, politics is everything. He's on trial for fraud, bribery, breach of trust in a Jerusalem district court, 3 years running. He must remain Prime Minister of Israel if he's going to have any chance of weakening, avoiding, and running that indictment. And that means catering and courting, acquiescing to a government, two ministers of which are Jewish supremacists, homophobic, right-wing extremists.
Well, in playing that domestic political card, he seems to have revealed Joe Biden as someone without any great authority about what happens in the Middle East. Is that a reasonable analysis?
I think Netanyahu understands that there are limits beyond which he cannot go. The key test will come where I think at the end of this month, early February, when the administration's expectation, not hope, expectation, is that the ground campaign, which is now in central and southern Gaza, will fundamentally be altered with fewer airstrikes, fewer artillery, brigade-sized intelligence-driven operations, which should minimize Palestinian deaths and allow a surge, because that's what Gaza needs, of humanitarian assistance. If President Biden does not get satisfaction on that issue, he has other options. But I think he's been reluctant to use them.
And what are those options?
As far as the options, I think there are three. Number one, slow walk, restrict, or end military assistance, particularly the delivery of precision-guided munitions and small diameter bombs. That's one. Number two, change voting posture in New York at the Security Council. Be willing to vote for a UN Security Council resolution or abstain. And finally, then what I would describe to you as the nuclear option, which is to essentially buy on to where the international community is, most of it anyway, on Gaza. We need a cessation of hostilities, full stop. Maybe in return for the release of all the hostages, which is exactly the trade I think that Hamas wants. Hamas wants to trade the 136 hostages they hold, 20 or 25 that the Israelis believe were either killed in Gaza, their bodies brought for trade, or died in captivity, for an asymmetrical trade, literally to empty the Israeli prisons, 6,000, and for cessation of hostilities. Should Hamas actually get that deal, it would be a tremendous victory for them, which is one of the reasons that the current government, particularly Mr. Netanyahu, well, I think needs this war to go on in hopes that he could achieve something significant which would somehow buffer and protect him from what may be within the next year a conviction.
And if Israel does downgrade its military actions in Gaza, what capacity is there for President Biden or even a re-elected President Trump to have a role in forging a new status quo?
Right, great question. We can dispense with the Trump hypothetical. Donald Trump is reelected. I mean, U.S. foreign policy is going to undergo a rather dramatic change. On the Arab-Israeli Middle East piece of it, I think the ever transactional Donald Trump will default to what he wanted to do as president, which is to strengthen relations with Saudi Arabia and create what I've called and written a sort of sugar high for the Israelis. It doesn't mean that he trusts Netanyahu or even likes him. When you enter Donald Trump's orbit, I mean, nobody is bulletproof here. As for Biden, I think you'd have to divide what Biden is prepared to do into two phases. Number one, what is he prepared to do between now and the election? And should he get a second term, what is he prepared to do then? The real problem here, the conflict or the confrontation that could make Gaza look mild by comparison, is if in fact you get a major confrontation between Israel and Hezbollah in the north. You're going to end up with Hezbollah using their high trajectory weapons that cover most of Israel. Hundreds of Israelis will be killed. The Israelis will preempt or respond against Lebanese infrastructure, against the south, against southern Beirut, where Hezbollah's headquarters are. Thousands of Lebanese may die. The Americans would be drawn into this because Iran will trigger pro-Iranian militias in Iraq and Syria, as they've been doing without killing any Americans yet, to intensify their attacks. The Houthis in the Red Sea would escalate. And it would not surprise me if during the course of this conflict you saw Israeli and or American strikes against Iranian assets in the Gulf or Iran proper, which would obviously mean a missile response by Iran probably against the Gulf and Israel. That's a regional war. If Biden could claim by the end of 2024 that he stabilized that front, that would be a good year. Progress toward a Palestinian state, not a chance. That's something, peace initiative, that's something that, should Biden get a second term, having voted for Republicans and Democrats and worked for Republicans and Democrats, I would say it's a matter of the national interest, and I hope he does get a second term. Then perhaps a better pathway ahead would be made available for Israelis and Palestinians. That's a pretty full plate. But if he could do that in 2024, he'd be way ahead of the game.
So it's all pretty bleak. Speaking about the conflict, you've said we are in a very dark tunnel, but you want to keep some optimism. You say we should all try to bend the arc of history. How do we do that?
The key to all of this is the one variable that's been missing. And I presided and participated in most of the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations that the U.S. has sponsored over the course of the last 20 plus years. We really are lacking, both in Israel and in a putative Palestinian state, we're lacking leaders. We need leaders who are masters of their political houses, not prisoners of their ideologies, willing to understand that conflict is not one hand clapping. It's probably Goethe's definition of a tragedy, which is competing justices. You need leaders like that. You need a Sadat and a Begin, or a Rabin and a King Hussein. Even Rabin and Yasser Arafat in his first incarnation during the early Oslo years. But you can't do this. And you're going to need leadership in Washington, I might add, as well, obviously. But you cannot do this without leaders who own the negotiations, not because the U.S., the UN, or anyone is telling them to, but because they've identified the reality that this is essential for the security and stability and prosperity of their respective publics. That's what you need, and that's what we don't have. You need a Mandela and a de Klerk to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem, I'm afraid. And it's hard for me to envision or imagine that kind of leadership emerging. But, I mean, who would have ever believed, I wouldn't, that apartheid would end the way it did?
Aaron David Miller, thank you so much for your time tonight.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.